Welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm your host, AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Dr. Laury Silvers. She's a retired professor of early Islamic mysticism, specialising in gender, and now she writes historical fiction set in the time of her research, which is 10th century Baghdad. Laury, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm very excited.
So today you're here to talk to us about the mystic Shawana. But before we talk about her, could you tell us how you got interested in mysticism as an area of study?
I became a graduate student in Islamic studies by accident. I was going to study to be a high school English teacher. And when I was in my last year of undergraduate work, I took a course on the medieval mystic Ibn al-Arabi. It was a comparative class with Meister Eckhart, actually. And I just loved it. My mind exploded. I adored it. I loved thinking these ideas. This was just everything. And the professor, Dr. William Chittick, he said to me, I want you to be my graduate student. And he just put me in his department under him. I had no Arabic. I had no Persian. I had no study of religion behind me. I had no study of history behind me. I had zero. I had a BA in English and American literature. And that was it. And I was just thrown into this program. So it took me 10 years to get my doctorate because I had a lot of work to do to catch up, including language study to get there. So I was working on mysticism throughout. My Persian was never very good. So that actually limited me to early mysticism when Persian isn't a player yet. So all the texts really are in Arabic. So I focused on early mysticism. And then from there, little by little, started working on women's sources. I got asked to do an encyclopedia article on early mystic women. And from that point on, that door had opened for me. And I started looking at that more deeply, and that became a major point of focus.
You are our first guest who works outside of the field of Western Christian mysticism. So could you tell us a little bit about what it's like to work on early Islamic mystics?
Probably in the history of Christianity, graduate students have a hard time finding something that goes unstudied. Within Islamic studies, a great deal has gone unstudied, especially the history of women, which is being filled out by some wonderful scholars now. But really, there's not a lot of scholarship done on early women, and partly that's because there's not a lot of sources on early women. So when you're coming to work on early mystic women, you're working with a slim number of manuscripts with threads of reports here and there. And it's not quite like picking up and working on a particular text and being able to use that as the basis of your scholarship. You've got to do an enormous amount of reading and research in all sorts of different areas in order to pull all these threads together to tell a story about what was going on with early mystic women in the past. We also have very few documents written in the hand of mystic women over the history of Islam up to the modern period. There's a woman by the name of Nana Asma'u in, I think we would say it's Nigeria now. And so we have her writing, and we have the writing of Aisha Bayunia, who is an Arab mystic in the 1200s. So we have some of that, but really most of what we have is what's been reported by men in biographical accounts of wise people, threads that show up here and there in all sorts of different sources. So it's an enormous amount of work for anybody trying to work on women in the early period. So it's relatively unstudied, and I was one of the few people who did work on it.
So while the process of finding and piecing together all of these details is obviously difficult, it isn't impossible, as you are here to speak to us about a particular mystic. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
I'm going to focus on the story of one woman about whom a little bit more is written than usual. Her name is Shawana, and I wanted to focus on her because she's a weeper. She's one of the weepers. And I thought maybe a weeping mystic would be of interest to people who are typically hearing stories about Christian mystics.
We have definitely discussed a few weepers already, so this area is ripe for comparison.
So we have all sorts of different kinds of early mystic women, and the practices tend to be very regional. So in areas where weeping shows up for particular cultural reasons and historical reasons, and I'll explain why in a little bit, we tend to find women who weep more. And in other areas that had different sort of political circumstances, different social circumstances, weeping is sort of not a practice and something that they actually sort of look down on a bit. So the practices tend to be very regional, very focused on different theological trends within different regions. So Sufi women, mystic women, or pious women from these early periods will have attitudes towards God's will. Is there freedom? Is there no freedom? Is there a reason why I'm going to hell, or does God have all the say? Is it due to my own works, or is it God's decision? Those statements will show up in different regions according to the theological trends in those areas, which is one of my favorite things to point out when people say, well, mystical experience, spirituality is all one. Spirituality is this universal experience. And I always try to say, well, the experience may be universal, but the articulation of it is historically bound and culturally bound. And so somebody may have an experience of God. This is something I can't speak to, but I can speak to the way they articulate it. And they articulate it in these very particular ways that are bound up to their location in history and their specific location at a place. So the weepers tend to come from areas that were known for a particular political resistance at the time. So I don't know how familiar your listeners will be, but there was a bit of a dispute when Muhammad died about who would follow him. And there were a group of people who said, it's got to be this guy. And there were a group of people who said, no, it's got to be the other guy. And one of the guys was his son-in-law, Ali. And for many Sufi orders, he was a spiritual gate. He was a person who had an enormous spiritual presence. He was a great warrior. He wasn't apparently much of a political leader, which is why some of the other people felt he wouldn't be the right person to lead. But he was a person of enormous spiritual charisma. And so a lot of people really wanted him to follow, and they believed that he had been chosen by Muhammad to follow. And the political tensions that come after this dispute lead to outright battles and massacres and tragedies, including the tragedy at Karbala, when many members of the Prophet's own family are killed in order to uphold the political argument on the other side. So that's the sort of short form without giving a lot of the details. And the people who supported Ali tended to have a practice of weeping and wailing in order to encourage men to continue to fight in resistance against this political movement to sideline Ali and his sons from their political right. And that continues on in these regions.
So how does weeping transition from a political action into a religious, mystical practice?
Prior to Muhammad coming in pre-Islamic Arabia, weeping and wailing for the dead was a huge thing. Women would rend their garments. They would scream and wail and pull at their hair. They would scratch their faces and their chests, bringing out blood. It was an enormous passion play of emotion for the dead. And many of these women could even be hired out to come and do this, but this was something that you would expect all your female compatriots to join you in when someone had died. And it's an important way for women to bind together as a community. But when Muhammad comes, one of the things that happens is that this practice is seen as a rejection of the idea that God wills death on people, and a rejection of the idea that there is a life that comes after this world that is better than the one that they are living in. And so women are deprived of this ability to bond together through this practice and to support each other through grief in this practice. There's an enormous amount of social pressure to stop them from doing this. And this pressure carries on in different regions in different ways. So in those regions where there is no political resistance to the caliphate, we find that women wail and weep in reduced ways, but nothing that requires enormous social intervention. But in those areas where people are still resisting the caliphate because they're followers of Ali and his sons, Hassan and Hussein, there we find the wailing continues because it's continuing on as part of political resistance. And so the resistance against women wailing and weeping becomes even stronger. And one of the things that happens as the political weeping is being put down is that pious weeping starts to become a bigger practice. So nobody can tell somebody not to weep for God. They can tell you not to weep for your dead brother. They can tell you not to wail for a political reason, but they've got nothing to say to you if you're weeping for God's sake. And so we see this transfer of weeping from the arena of humane grief over to pious and mystic weeping in these areas in which weeping was a very big deal for political reasons.
So Shawana was from one of these weeping regions.
She was from a weeping region. She was from just outside of Basra, which was an area that mainly supported Ali and his family line. And so weeping always remained important there. We find an enormous number of weepers, both men and women, in that region. And so Shawana is from one of these regions. She weeps so much that one of my favorite stories about Shawana is that, a man says to another man, "Wow, you visited Shawana. What did you hear from her? Share with me what it is that you understood." And he's like, "I didn't understand anything. She was weeping so much, I couldn't understand a thing she was saying." No, obviously, some people did get enough out of conversations with her that they were able to write some of the things that she said down, but apparently her weeping was extraordinary. And she was even tested to some degree about whether or not this weeping was sincere. And so one man says to his son who had visited her, "Tell me about her weeping." And he says, "Well, she just weeps a lot." And the father says, no, tell me the exact place in the eye she weeps from. And so this is super interesting to people who study the body, actually. But he says she weeps from all corners of her eyes, that there's no way to find out if she's weeping sincerely or not. So if you're a faker, then I guess maybe, if you're producing fake tears, like movie tears, maybe the tears would just come from the corner of your eye. But if these are real tears, then you're overwhelmed by weeping, and this is something that cannot be faked. And so it talks about her weeping in that respect and says, her heart is burnt with sorrow and love of God. She's just burnt over. She's the real deal. And this was a thing that happened at that time, in any case, in which women were constantly having to be vouched for by men about whether or not it was okay for them to act in ways that were socially a bit strange, ways most men would prefer perhaps their wives did not act, let's say. And so women would be vouched for by men. Men would come forward and say, "No, this woman is so pious. I tried to marry her." Let's say she wasn't married. "I tried to marry her and she refused me. She refused me. Don't worry about her at all. She's fine. She's good." These kinds of stories.
As you mentioned earlier, finding these women involves pulling together a lot of different threads. So what kind of information do we have about Shawana and her life and experiences?
We're just dealing with shreds of material at this point. And in a lot of cases, the accounts we have, how trustworthy are they? Because they're transmitted by men over centuries. We have no idea the degree to which they've been embellished. We have no idea the degree to which they could be stories about other women that are attributed to her because she was a big deal for all intents and purposes. So there could have been another woman who said or did similar things, and that just gets forgotten, that was about her, and gets attributed to Shawana. Or somebody has a story, let's say a saying that their wonderful mystic cousin said that was really profound and wonderful, but nobody cares about their mystic cousin or thinks that their mystic cousin had any authority. So they put it in the mouth of Shawana in order to give it more weight. And then ultimately that saying will end up in the mouth of a man at some point, right? So we know these sayings actually traveled in this way. They weren't always appended to the person who actually said them. We're always on shaky ground. So we don't know exactly when Shawana lived, but it's sometime in the 700s. She has one statement where somebody says something to her about her status, and she says, "Well, who am I? Who is Shawana but a sinful black slave?" And then another statement in which she's with her husband at the Kaaba in Mecca, and he says something, and she recites some Persian poetry to him. And so some people think that she was Persian because of her use of that Persian poetry. And when she says, "I'm nothing but a sinful black slave," that's her saying, "I am at the lowest rung of society," because an enslaved Black woman would be absolutely at the lowest social level.
And a sinful one for that matter.
And a sinful one, not a pious enslaved woman of African descent, but a sinful Black slave, right? And so some people say she's Persian and she's using this racialized statement in order to talk about how low her station is. Whereas other people say, well, there were people who were enslaved who lived among people who were Persian. And so there's no reason why she wouldn't have known Persian and picked up some Persian poetry and use that Persian poetry, and that statement about her being an enslaved Black woman would have been there. And enslaved people could marry. So she could have been enslaved and manumitted, or she could have still been enslaved at that time and married and had children. All of those things are possible. But that's literally what we've got to go on. Like, that's it. There's really so little we can say. And we'll never know the answer to that. My guess is that most people side with her on being Persian, and that she's using that statement about being a sinful Black slave as a way of talking about her status, because typically in these sources, if somebody had Black skin, it was pointed out. So somebody would actually be called so-and-so a Sauda, meaning the Black one. So that would typically be appended. But that may not always have been the case. We don't know, but there is enough written about her that we could assume that somebody would have said she was a Black woman, that there's enough that's there. So I think the weight is going to come down on her being Persian, but really, literally, that's what we have to go on. We're just dealing with shreds of material at this point.
Okay, so outside of her weeping, do we know anything about her religious practices or how she connected to the divine?
She would have these experiences. We call them qabd and bust. The bust is these expansive experiences where you're feeling the expansiveness of God in you, and the tears are flowing and the poetry is flowing and the wisdom is flowing. And then you have these periods of spiritual desolation, this kind of crampedness within one's soul in which you are not feeling God's presence so much. And so during one of these periods, apparently somebody came to her in a dream and recited these verses to her, saying, "Spill tears if you have grief, as tears of grief provide relief. Strive to be straight, try to be upright on the path, to fast, and to heave sighs of burning grief, for the way of those acquiescent to God is to live with sighs and burning grief."
That's really beautiful and connects so well to what you were saying earlier about the tradition of weeping and wailing and grieving in these regions.
It's doing a couple of things, because when she would be afflicted by spiritual desolation, people could take that as being a sign that God was unhappy with her and the way in which she was articulating her mysticism, that she had overstepped her bounds as a woman. She had overstepped the bounds of piety, the degree to which she was weeping and wailing. And so the transmission of a dream that affirms her practice would be another way of vouching for her that her way is right and good, and these moments of desolation are part of the path and she should stick to it.
And as you mentioned earlier, these forms of reinforcing the appropriateness and piety of these women is so important. I want to transition slightly here because, as I mentioned in your introduction, you have retired from the world of academia and you are now writing historical fiction. How do the works of mystics like Shawana feature in your writing?
So Shawana actually was the basis for my main character, Zaytuna, for her mother. And so I have this long section, 2 chapters in the first book, The Lover, that gives the history of this woman's wandering and the effect this woman's wandering had on her children. One of the things that I asked myself when I was studying these women's lives was, okay, here are these women who are wandering through the countryside, who are wandering through cities and towns. And we know from all sorts of other sources in the period that certainly there would have been various kinds of assault. She would have been open to people maybe trying to rob her. She would have been open to sexual assault. She would have been open to harassment. There's stories of kids throwing stones at women like this. All sorts of difficulties would have faced a woman who wandered. And I wondered, what would it be like for a woman like that who has chosen to not be married, to not choose a life of safety, to not choose a life of stability, but to choose this very risky life of wandering in ecstasy of God, to be alone with her beloved, to end up in a situation in which she is pregnant without her consent. And what would life be for those children? And so even though Shawana was married and had children, she formed the backbone of the character of Zaytuna's mother, who is like a number of other women, many of whom were of African descent, who were these women who were from the lowest rungs of society in some cases. There were women of African descent at the highest rungs of society. The majority of the caliph's mothers were enslaved Black women who were part of these harems, and they were of the highest social classes. But other women of African descent would have been at the lowest level of society. And some of these women on manumission, if they were ecstatics, would wander in ecstasy. And we do have some reports about that. And I tried to sort of bring all of those reports together to talk about the risks that these women took and the kinds of resistance that they faced in being themselves in love with God in a world that didn't necessarily have an easy space for them to be that way.
I feel like it must be really freeing and rewarding to be able to kind of think about these ideas and concepts in different ways. But it does make me wonder, how did you find the transition from academic to fiction writing?
It's a good question. And now that I've had time to think about it over the past 2.5 years since I've been writing these books, I realized that I wasn't really writing fiction at first. That the first book, The Lover, is explicitly a work of academic fiction. It's deeply historical in ways that are inappropriate to writing a historical mystery, which I didn't realize until historical mystery readers were a bit confounded by how much history was in my books. And I had always thought that books like Name of the Rose, which have so much history in them, would be the touchstone for the kind of work that I was trying to create, where Eco really was making academic arguments in that book. He really was trying to say something, and he's bringing so much research to bear in that text. I mean, granted, I'm not quoting Latin at readers.
I mean, thank goodness.
But I am bringing all these arguments to bear. I am bringing all this nuance to bear. I am bringing everything that I thought as an academic into a narrative. And I found out when I visited some online groups who read historical mysteries that they hate Name of the Rose. And I had no idea. Like, this was just one of my favorite books. So I thought, oh, historical mystery readers are just going to love this because Name of the Rose, and I'm doing something similar. And they hated it. What they mainly want is a straight through mystery that has historical context informing it, where it's a straight up mystery just set at another time. Some of the books like Philippa Gregory's and things do have much more history in them, but they've also been able to tell a much more straight through mystery line. And my book really does spend some time in historical circumstances. I tell an account of an early hadith recital where a scholar is at the head of a mosque where hundreds and hundreds of people have gathered to hear him recite these reports of the prophet. And there's really very little of the mystery that's being explored in that situation. I just wanted to show how that happens and how women were pushed out of these gatherings and what it meant for women to be a scholar at that period of time, that she only would have the ability to be a scholar if she were elite. And then even if she were elite, she would be pushed out in big events like this that were actually important for being a scholar and hearing these reports and being able to transmit them themselves. So there was all this sort of work I was doing that in these novels that I couldn't do in my academic text. Stories about this kind of regionalism, these social nuances that I was limited in the way I could discuss them in my academic work, I was able to really bring out in all the ways that I had been thinking about them and imagining them in my mind as I was doing my academic work, I was able to bring out in fiction. So the first book really is a transition from academic work to fiction. And because it is so historical, it actually gets used as a classroom textbook in Intro to Islam courses and in Sufism courses and in Gender in Islam courses. But it's not caught on the way I had hoped with historical mystery readers. And I certainly understand now why that's the case. And I'm trying to sort of move towards having a stronger mystery story straight through and linger less on those historical questions as I'm learning the craft of writing historical mysteries. But I've given in and accepted the fact that these 4 books in this series, before I start a new series, will be very, very highly historical mysteries, and just felt that I had to do what's important to me in these, and then I'll move on to something that fits the genre more completely in the next book.
Well, in my humble opinion, there are far worse things in literary life than modeling your work after the brilliance of Umberto Eco. But that could just be me. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining me today, Laury, and for telling us a little bit about Shawana and about your work. It has been a true pleasure.
It's wonderful to talk. I wish we could all talk more, those of us who talk about female mystics, that we could get together and talk more about all these things. I just feel like there's so much more we could have discussed, and I'm grateful for the amount of time you were able to give me. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you. And thank you all for listening. Please check out the Sufi Mysteries. The link is in the show notes. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic, and join me next time when I speak to Liam Temple about Augustine Baker.